it's a much younger Robert Fisk with more darker hair. It clearly is real. So, obviously, as a correspondent, I felt something was coming. Not from necessarily the Bosnian Muslims, no, but there was going to be a Muslim reaction. You know, I would come away from Bosnia absolutely exhausted. War is very exhausting. And I'd get back to Beirut, very tired, and I'd relax. I'd open the morning papers, all over the front page, pictures of blood in Sarajevo, right?
Yeah.
Muslim countries, see? Yes. But I never sort of thought, hang on a second, Robert, it's connected.
Of course.
There's a connection here. These people are not putting Bosnia on page 1 because it happens to be a story. They're putting it there because it intimately involves all the Muslim peoples of the Middle East. Of course it does. And I missed out on the degree of anger in the Arab world about Bosnia. You know, bin Laden often talks about Bosnia. In his long, if you actually read or listen to him, he talks about Bosnia a lot. Obviously had a big effect. And many of my friends in the Middle East, they always go back to Bosnia in conversations because they know I was there. They want to talk about it. They talked about it then, they talked about it afterwards, they still talk about it now. And in my next book, which is a companion volume to The Great War for Civilization, which is coming out in Bosnian, by the way, in Sarajevo, in the new book, I'm actually going back to Bosnia, and it'll be my eyewitness of the war. But I'm going to go into that connection between the anger of the Muslim world, anger which involves Israel and Palestine, and the fact that, you know, you have people who've kept the faith, you know, under the pressure of the West and so on, and link it up with the anger over Bosnia. You know, we like to say, oh, we came to the rescue in the end, we bombed the Serbs and brought... Well, it took a few years before we got round to it because, you know, you didn't have an awful lot of oil and you didn't have an awful lot of gas. Yes. And in the meantime, 250,000 people died, and we let, you know, the women of Bosnia be raped in their thousands and did nothing. The United Nations, you know, there was no doubt that the behaviour of the United Nations, the performance of UNPROFOR, which was never meant, of course, to be a Bosnian protection force, it was meant to be having a holiday in Sarajevo, what it tried to do with Croatia. There's no doubt that the Arab concept of the United Nations as an institution that could not be trusted, but which always had been trusted in the past with Security Council resolutions. I think it came to the fore in Bosnia.
Also Srebrenica moment. It cannot be trusted.
You know, I mean, you can go where you want, but at the end of the day, the UN's performance in Srebrenica, the Dutch-backed performance, the performance of the generals in Zagreb, was so lamentable that I think many Muslims in the Middle East, Arab Muslims, and Muslims elsewhere in the Middle East, said, we are on our own. We can only count on ourselves. We are the only people who can do that. Enough is enough. And in various forms, refusal to abide by UN Security Council resolutions, hatred of America, the extraordinary popularity of bin Laden among Arabs, which is a fact, whether you like it or not, particularly in Saudi Arabia. I think that it came about because of the Bosnian War. Not solely, but partly. I think the Bosnian War was another match thrown into the petrol, you know, with the oil. But of course these things are more obvious now, you know, sitting in Lillehammer more than a decade after the war than they were at the time, because, you know, in a war you're tired, you're trying to stay alive, you're trying to make sure your newspaper prints what you write. It was, you know, as much... Your brain was occupied with survival, and also, well, yours was too.
Yeah, of
but
course.
Also in our case, you know, making sure we got the story right and we were representing it. But as I say, I think that in retrospect, well, you always learn. You know, I learn more about Iraq's invasion in 2003 now than I learned at the time. But I keep all my notes so I can go back. And sometimes when I go back when I'm writing, I go through notes and I say, so that's why that happened. You know?
Oh, no.
And you realise that years later. But because I've got everything, hundreds of thousands of pages, mostly on the Middle East, but also Bosnia. But all my notes from Bosnia, all the newspapers I was collecting at the time.
So this book, it will be published in Sarajevo when?
No. The previous book, The Great War for Civilization, which is not about Bosnia, will be published next year in Sarajevo. That is the agreement anyway. I've spoken to the editor. I've got 14 editions in different languages, I mean, from Catalan to, you know, South Korean. But then the new book, which won't be out for 3 years, I don't know if it'll have. I think it might have, because there'll be a lot on Bosnia in it.
So, also one question. Do you think all this, you mentioned today also on conference, we listen, you know, terrorism, you know.
Terror.
Yes. We listen that so much. Is this war against terrorism? Is this war against Islam, or is this war to get power?
You mean the current war?
Current war.
It's a war against America's enemies. It was a war that was launched to make America all-powerful, and it failed. If you embark on ideological or theological wars, you will fail. Wars of national interest, you might or might not win. But, you know, I mean, I asked the question this morning, you know, Tony Blair, our former dear, beloved Prime Minister, who is such a close believer in faith and God, and God didn't give him any advice. God did not say to him in 2003, Tony, this Iraq thing may not be such a good idea. You know, God didn't communicate with him. It was a one-way communication, I imagine, because when you're a Prime Minister, you think you're the God, and you tell him what